Hello everyone and welcome to another session of our weekly live discussion series. My name is Naveen Agarwal and I'm so excited to welcome all of you again. I hope you are getting value out of these sessions. If you're joining for the first time, we do this every week. And the goal here is to talk about day-to-day practical problems when we try to implement risk management for our medical device. Now believe me, I've been in this industry for many years and I still feel that actual practice of risk management is quite challenging. So that is the goal of these conversations, is to have a dialogue and talk about day-to-day problems with full understanding of what the requirements are and what they mean, what they don't mean. So it's a public forum. I request that you do not share any proprietary information or any business sensitive information. Stay professional at all times, especially if you disagree with any other comments or discussions going on in the chat. We are not here to debate or argue. This is also not a webinar or a lecture. I certainly don't have all the answers. I do have a lot of experience and I've seen a lot of different problems and challenges, but I'm open to hearing from you. What are the questions and challenges that you face? Today, we will be talking about the P1, P2 approach for estimating probability of harm. That's a very technical topic and I've seen that in the industry. People use it all the time and they come across a lot of problems. Sometimes it works well and I've seen good implementations of P1, P2, but sometimes it also creates a lot of problems. And if you are using the P1, P2 approach, I want to hear from you. What are the challenges that you face as you try to actually, for example, look at your post-market data? When the data begins to come in from post-market, is it easy for you to review that data and see if your estimated risk levels have changed? That's what this is all about. At the end of the day, we should be able to easily analyze our post-market data and see if the risk level has changed and take appropriate action quickly. That's what it's all about. Now, one final point about our discussions: nothing we say here or discuss here or share here should be taken as regulatory advice. This is just for information sharing only. And it's not always about problems or questions or challenges. It's also about sharing best practices. So in your experience, in your day-to-day work, I actually invite you to share your ideas, your best practices in the chat. Anytime during the conversation or presentation, please share in the chat. First of all, just introduce yourself, where you are joining from, and what you do as part of your risk management process or quality management system. Even if you are in product development or medical safety or regulatory affairs, what it is that you do, please share in the chat below. And anytime during the conversation, share any questions and comments. So the way we're going to do our discussion today is roughly about 30 minutes in all, and I'll set the stage with only a few introductory slides. And as I mentioned before, this is not a webinar or a lecture. I will definitely go over the key concept with you and some of the challenges that I have seen. But after that, it is open. And the more we engage, the more we share in the chat, the more useful it will be for all of us. And those of you who are not able to join live, this session will be recorded. So even when you are watching it while it's being recorded or a recorded replay, share your questions and comments and get the discussion going. Sounds like a plan? Let's look into the slides very quickly. So we're going to talk about the high-level estimating probability of harm. This is what it's all about. And as we know, there are two components to risk: probability of harm and the severity of that harm. It's the combination of the two that gives us the risk level. So we are talking about the probability of harm. And there are two ways. The first one is what I call a top-down direct method. Based on your post-market data, you look at the number of events resulting in harm and you divide that by the total opportunities. This is like a frequency. You can call it likelihood, you can call it probability, but it's a rate at which a specific harm is occurring to your patient or user. You can look at the data and do a top-down approach. This works in many different cases. It's very simple, easy to implement, and very easy to evaluate if the probability of harm level has changed based on post-market data. Now the second one is what I call the bottom-up indirect method. This is where P1, P2 comes, and we'll talk a lot more about P1, P2 in this discussion today. Note that Probability of harm is the multiplication of the two. This is a mathematical formula and must be valid. P1 is probability of a hazardous situation occurring, and P2 is the probability of hazardous situation leading to harm. And the combination is very, very specific from a mathematical point of view. You multiply the two probability numbers, and that gives you the probability of harm. So, first question for you is, are you using this formula as is? Or are you estimating P1 on, let's say, a scale of 1 to 5, estimating P2 on a scale of 1 to 5, and there's not probability numbers, these are discrete numbers, a scale 1 to 5, and you are trying to combine the two, you don't know how. I would love to hear from you how it is that if you are using P1, P2, how it is that you are combining P1 and P2. So please share in the chat below your approach. So what's the relationship between P1 and P2? Let's understand that. And I've discussed this overall schematic in other conversations, but at the high level, it all starts with a trigger event. It doesn't have to be a device failure. It could be any event. That leads to a sequence of events where a patient or the user is exposed to one or more hazards in a hazardous situation, and that leads to the harm. One or more harms. I've shown this to be a linear flow, not always a linear flow. Multiple hazardous situations could occur from a single event, and multiple harms could occur from the same hazardous situation. Event doesn't have to be a device failure. Let's really be very clear about that. Now, this analysis is done in hazard analysis, and we have talked about that in one of our live sessions. There's a recording available. You can watch. We can discuss this topic in future discussions also if there's interest. So you can do a bottom-up analysis from the trigger event or the top-down analysis from the harm. But here's what the P1 is. P1 is the probability of the occurrence of a hazardous situation starting from a trigger event. Many things could happen that leads to P1. But P2 is very specific. This comes into play only when a hazardous situation has occurred. So P2 is hazardous situation leading to harm. Very, very important. Now, understanding conditional probability is important to understand why that mathematical rule should apply. So you have a hazard, you have one outcome that the patient or the user is exposed to that hazard, or the other outcome is not exposed. If the patient is exposed, it may result in no harm, which is a good thing, or it may result in harm. And in this decision tree, we can apply some probabilities. So PA, let's call PA as the patient being exposed. PA prime is patient not being exposed. Those are the two outcomes. And then P of B given A is a conditional probability of harm, and then you can apply to no harm as well. Now there is a very nice theorem from Bayes, and here PA is P1 and PB given A is P2. Bayes theorem can be applied, and that is where the multiplication of the two is important. It has to be holding true. This is a mathematical relationship. We cannot violate that. Second thing to note is P1 and P2, there is no different weighting applied to it. It's not like P2 is more important than P1. They are equally weighted in this formula. So that is very important. So share with me if you are utilizing P1 and P2 this way, and if you are not, how do you combine P1 and P2 to get to POH? Share that in the chat below. Now let's look at a specific example to illustrate this point. We are, good news, coming out of COVID just now, but we have experienced an enormous amount of stress in the last 2 years. So let's take a hazardous situation where a person is infected with COVID-19 and think about, so that will be the hazardous situation. So the first question is, how would you estimate the rate of this hazardous situation or occurrence of this hazardous situation? Well, we have a lot of data, or we monitored a lot of data about rate of infection. The rate of infection could be utilized for P1 in this case, in a certain area. Now, let's look at different outcomes. Given that a person is infected, you could have different outcomes, and I have oversimplified this in many ways. There are many more complexities, many more details. I've oversimplified it. So the one outcome, which happened a lot, is many people continue to remain asymptomatic, and they recovered without any therapy. Very good news. or they developed some symptoms, they received primary medical care, remained isolated, and recovered. The other outcome is slightly more serious, experiences worsening symptoms, and is hospitalized. Many people had to go to the hospital, but they recovered without any long-term effects. Now, many people were hospitalized. They went to the ICU, they recovered, but they had long-term effects. And in the extreme case, many people died despite medical attention in the ICU. So we could assign a severity level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on a 1 to 5 scale to this and estimate a probability of if a person is infected with COVID, what will be the chance, the likelihood that they will experience one of these 5 scenarios. There was some data out there which I looked at, but this is only for illustration. So let's say the first outcome 10% of the time, or 0.1. Second outcome was more common. If they were infected, many people developed symptoms, they remain at home, isolated, and they recovered 70% or 0.7. So I have developed, let's say, a numerical number. So the question would be, in your scenario, how would you be developing this range? Notice that these numbers, they all add up to a 1. And that is also very important, that the second mathematical rule has to be satisfied. They all need to add up to 1. So this was just an example, but I would love to hear from you in the chat. Please share below. What is your approach and how do you estimate P1 and P2 values for the different scenarios that are applicable for your medical device? Here are the 2 main challenges in my experience. Now again, I would love to hear from you what challenges you are facing. Failure modes do not always equal a hazardous situation. Many hazardous situation occurs even when there is no device failure. An exact sequence of events we don't know. So we really cannot build this sequence of events. So what do we do? And I would love to hear from you if you have come across this challenge and how you have solved this. Second challenge I have seen is no direct link between a specific hazardous situation and a specific harm. No direct link. I have looked at data for different types of medical devices, and in many cases, even as high as about 70 to 80% of the adverse events reported to the FDA for many types of devices, there is no assignable cause to the device. So that's the challenge. How do we figure out what is P1 related to the failure of our device and what is P2 for the outcomes that our device may lead to? So these are some of the challenges, but I would love to hear from you. Okay, so we have a comment here from Marisa. I hope I'm saying your name correctly. Thank you for sharing this. I believe the company I work with uses complaints data from the device itself for similar devices to estimate probability. Correct. You could use post-market data, but how you use it, what kind of data is available, and the quality of that data matters a lot. And one example I can share with you where I have seen an incorrect use of data is estimation of P2. It is wrong to estimate P2 based on the direct POH method that I talked about. If you have the number of events for a certain type of harm, you take that as a numerator, divide that by the number of opportunities, could be disposable devices or single-use devices or a procedure or a patient hour, however you want to call it. That is the overall rate of harm. And I have seen people use that as a substitute for P2. That is not true. The example that we just shared with you or in the slides clearly shows you that P2 is dependent on a certain situation. In every situation, there could be one or more outcomes, and P2 is the specific probability of those outcomes given that situation. Very, very specific and very difficult to tease it out from post-market data. And I would love to hear from you what you have seen in practice, how people have used the post-market data for P1 and P2. Please continue to share your thoughts on this. So I mentioned an incorrect use of post-market data. That was P2. How could you use the post-market data on device-related problems that are reported to you as maybe a substitute for P1? I've seen that happen as well. You could potentially use that if the data is accurate, reliable, and complete. And this is one challenge I believe we face in our industry, is that our complaints data is often not very reliable or accurate. The reliability of reportability changes. And we cannot confirm in many cases the alleged device issue. Now, from a regulatory point of view, it's a complaint. That's a different discussion. Any alleged deficiency with the device is a complaint. But an allegation, if not confirmed, we cannot use that to really estimate a probability, right? And that is where we struggle. So, if you are very, very confident of the quality of the data, reliability of the data, completeness of the data, I think it can be used quite effectively. But where we could run into problem is if we do not have high quality data, both in terms of quantity as well as completeness. If we don't have that, where we run the risk is underestimating. And this is where I believe the regulatory authorities are getting very sensitive. We talked about this last week, where I actually shared with you 2 warning letters. I believe they're getting pretty sensitive about the fact, their experience. I think there's a broad experience I'm sensing personally, would love to hear from you, that we are underestimating risk. And as a result, maybe our risk control measures are not adequate. This is a doubt and a skepticism, and I think I'm seeing that evidence in warning letters. So my goal here is to help you become aware of the limitations so you can make right assumptions and be clear about the uncertainty in your data, in your analysis. Okay, we have a comment from Taylor. Thank you for sharing this. One challenge I have come across recently is properly defining the denominator associated with P1. How to properly define number of uses is dependent on many factors, including single use or continuous duty cycle, number of devices in use, etc. Very, very good point, and thank you for sharing that. There are many ways you could use different things, but it is context dependent. I would say be very clear about the scenario, the situation, and your rationale for selecting an appropriate denominator. I'll share with you one warning letter I came across, fascinating, where actually FDA questioned the denominator being used for estimating the rate of occurrence. You would think that it'll be okay to use quantity sold. Let's say it's a implantable single-use device, and you say I sold 1,000 and I got 100 events, and I would estimate that to be 100 over 1,000, which is 10%, right? What FDA is saying, maybe not so fast. You sold 1,000, but maybe 50 of them were implanted, or let's say 500 of them were implanted, whatever. You need to use the number implanted. How do you get that number? Right? You have to keep track of every single device being used. So the reason I mentioned this example to you is it matters. What you use, why you use it, what's your rationale, and be prepared to be questioned by regulatory authorities about your decision. It is very important to select the right parameter. So these are very valid points, and my answer is it depends. Whatever you choose should be appropriate, and your rationale should be very clear. And see if it holds the red face test. Let's talk about that, right? Okay, so there's a follow-up from Marissa. Thank you. To follow up, what do you think the relationship should be between PMS data and P1 and P2? Ideally, it should be 1-to-1 or evolving over time and getting better. We live in an imperfect world. Medical device industry, we live in an imperfect world. It is best to go out at launch with an estimate. I would not advise you to use a PMS data for an existing product or a similar product for a new product you are developing, even though it might be like 90% same. What I would recommend at launch, you estimate based on engineering principles and medical judgment. Do your best shot. Understand the level of uncertainty. If the uncertainty is high, develop a very robust post-market plan for that specific product. Have a data plan in place, what you will gather, how you will analyze, and over time see how good is your estimate and bring it together. Let's give this product 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. We have a mature situation. Now, ideally, I would expect the relationship to be pretty good, pretty close to each other. And you have a good information about that. So to best answer that question, I think the tightness and the relationship between post-market data and your estimates should reflect the level of uncertainty you have with the maturity level of your product. It becomes difficult, but keep in mind that risk management is a life cycle topic, right? We have to monitor it over the life cycle of the device. Even though it's a very incremental innovation or simple line extension, we cannot be sure that the market data being reported for a similar product is appropriate. So maybe you do a first test there, see if it is appropriate and why. Play out the different scenarios. Maybe your intended use is slightly different. Maybe you are targeting a different geography. Maybe you have a product in Europe, you're bringing it to the United States. Patients are different, doctors are different. How they use it could be different, even though maybe your IFU is about the same. So what I'm trying to say is that it is better, in my opinion, to recognize a higher level of uncertainty for the product at launch. Nothing wrong with that. You can say this is our best estimate, and even given the best estimate, we can justify the benefit risk. That's all you have to do. Over time, you refine your estimates. You become better. Your data becomes better. It becomes more stable. It becomes more mature. Then you can say, yes, this is what we see. Thank goodness, maybe our estimates were more conservative, right? And you can align the two. So I hope that answers the question. Let me also clarify one thing, that a lot of the things that I'll discuss in these live discussions with you are not regulatory conversations. These conversations are more from the perspective of the practice of risk management, and my goal here is to help you get better, get more confident in your analysis, and have the true picture of your device at all times. That's what I'm trying to do. And in doing so, when you have a better understanding of these principles, learning from each other through these forums, we can think about different scenarios and we can figure out how to then do it efficiently and effectively. So this is very good conversation, and thank you for sharing this with you. Any other thoughts or topics or comments on this matter, please continue to post that in the chat. So how about a scenario where no data is available, right? I briefly talked about that. I actually asked you to not look at the PMS data for a similar product, 80%, 90% similar product. I asked you not to look at that for product in development and up to the point of launch. So let's say you are starting from scratch, right? If you're starting from scratch, engineering principles still apply. Understanding, you might have done a lot of testing in design. You might have done simulation testing of your subsystem, your system. You might have done actual design verification testing, process validation testing. You might have some internal non-conformance data. All that can help you to estimate the probability of failure. You can do that, right? You can make a very conservative assumption that if the device fails, hazardous situation will occur. So you could use that as a starting point. And most likely it will be conservative and still meet your requirements. So that could be the way to get out. Okay, so we have another follow-up comment from Taylor. Additionally, properly defining P1 within hazard analysis documentation is a challenge. P1 is the probability of a hazardous situation occurring. In my experience, it is common to see individual P1 values according to a specific risk line item, which includes separate hazards, hazardous situations, and harms. In order to buy more in alignment with the standard, do you agree it would be better to create a P1 according to a single specific hazardous situation, for example, patient exposed to electrical shock, and have the many of instances of trigger events that lead to that hazardous situation documented underneath this hazardous situation? I think it's a very good idea. So let's take a step back. Hazardous situation, this term causes a lot of confusion. And it's very vaguely defined in the standard. Circumstance in which people or property is exposed to one or more. What's a circumstance? A hazardous situation is not a frozen frame in a movie. It's not a snapshot. It's not like a instant in time. And sometimes we get confused by that. As a matter of fact, the hazardous situation, if patient is undergoing surgery to receive your medical device or patient is using the medical device, they're already in a hazardous situation, right? Surgery itself is a hazardous situation. So what specific hazardous situation we're going to talk about? It's very difficult to articulate precisely what the hazardous situation is. So what I like to do is I like to tell people to think of hazards. Let's think of hazards. Electrical shock, electricity is a hazard. Exposure to electricity, no matter how it happens, will cause the patient or the user to be in a hazardous situation. So we don't have to draw up a big map of sequence of events. We just need to be mindful of different sequence of events that can lead to that exposure. So I like to think of hazards. And I like to also think of device failures as activating or triggering a hazard. So when I say rate of hazardous situation occurring, an assumption I could make is that I will estimate the rate of hazards occurring with my device, either because the device failed or without the failure of the device, the use of the device, a hazard occurred. Rate of occurrence of a hazard is what I would equate that to be P1. And in that context, I think your suggestion is excellent. No matter how exposure to electrical shock happens, that's your rate of exposure. So what are the different ways you can have that hazard activated? Different failure rates, different components, assemblies, sub-assemblies, and you can do that engineering analysis. Same thing about breakdown of sterility, very common in our industry, right? One of the risks we identify, sterile barrier. Doesn't matter how the sterile barrier is broken sterile barrier presents a hazard because it can be biocontaminated. So we need to estimate the frequency of occurrence from different sources of that particular hazard. I hope that makes sense without going into too much detail, but the concept should be very clear is that let's think of hazards. Let's not get so tangled into hazardous situation, which is difficult to define precisely. Let's talk about hazards. And we can say that if the hazard is activated, that is the rate of hazardous situation, period. And if you get more information from post-market or clinical studies, in some scenarios, maybe you can be more specific. But in many of the scenarios, we don't get that. And it's good. Actually, when people tell me they don't have too much post-market data, and I said, it's a good thing because that means your device is working well. Patients are not being harmed, right? No news is good news. However, it presents a challenge in our risk analysis, and that's where we have to kind of be more creative, apply our engineering judgment, and be aware of the uncertainty. So I hope that makes sense. Let's see the time. We still have a few minutes left, but what I will try to do now is recap some of the key points that we discussed in our conversation today. P1, P2 is only one approach, and by the way, it is not even mandatory. It is not required by ISO 14971 that you must use P1, P2. Use it if it's useful to you. If it creates more problems, if it creates more uncertainties, more inaccuracies, more headaches in trying to explain it to anybody like an auditor or somebody else, there are other easier methods. So it's mandatory. That's number one, it's not mandatory. Now, if you are using P1, P2, understand that P1 is the probability of a hazardous situation occurring, which I like us to think as probability of a hazard occurring. And we make the assumption that exposure will happen immediately or after a certain time or certain events. Doesn't matter. The most conservative estimate is if a hazard occurs, hazardous situation also occurs. P2 is the hazardous situation leading to harm. That is very, very specific. It is a probability. It's not a rate. And all the different events have to be understood from a certain situation. And probability of all those events from a certain situation must add up to 1. Mathematical relationship has to be valid. Probability of harm in this case is the multiplication of P1 and P2. No abstract or unclear combination in a P1, P2 table. I've seen that happen, and I really don't understand how someone could combine P1 and P2 without using mathematics to come up with a POH. It is very hard to explain. And anything hard to explain, believe me, is probably not a good idea to use in your process. We talked a lot about post-market. Post-market data is useful if it is of high quality, high reliability, and it is complete. It is structured well, it is coded well in your system so you can extract the data for analysis. Those are serious challenges. We'll talk about postmarket, and I've a lot of experience in this area. We'll talk about postmarket in other future discussions. In the meantime, if you have any specific questions, you can always reach out to me through LinkedIn. So it's almost end of our time. I want to thank you again for your attention and attending today. This recording will be available, so if you know of colleagues who were not able to attend, please share this with you. We will be meeting every week, Tuesday or Thursday, and you will see that announcement in my LinkedIn feed. You don't have to do anything to register. It is open to all. Finally, I want to share with you some free stuff, and everyone loves free stuff. This is my website, achieveexcel.com. If you go there and just go to this tab, free stuff, you will find 2 very high quality free gifts from me. The first one is a template for hazard analysis. And when you download that template for free, you will also get a series of videos that will help you understand that template, use it, some best practices and things to avoid. The second gift is a free membership to my community of knowledge sharing. I call it Knowledge Sharing Forum. There are over 150 people there. It's a closed group. It's moderated by me. It's completely closed and you are free to join. So I hope you will take advantage of these free offers and stay in touch. I look forward to meeting you again next week or hearing from you through LinkedIn. Have a good one, everyone.